Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. Pasta Jardula here.
And Fiorella.
Johnny Sue is over there spinning on the ones and twos. And today, special guest in the house, friend of the show. You know him. He's running against Nancy Pelosi up there in the San Francisco area. Shahid Buttar is with us. How you doing, Shahid?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back, Pasta. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you here with us. So let's just jump right into it because we have a lot of great questions. So it's been a couple months since we saw each other. It's great to see you again. When we left San Francisco about 2 months ago, that's when we heard about all these sexual harassment allegations that came out against you and a woman named Elizabeth Croydon. Several articles and investigations brought many of those concerns, however, to a halt. You've addressed this on other outlets, and for those who have still not heard you, though, and still have some concerns, where do you stand on this right now, and how do you want to move forward?
Well, I stand on it insofar as the outlets that have investigated the claims have brought to the public facts that I've known for a while but haven't been in a position to share myself, which was that the person who had accused me recently of harassment had long accused me of all kinds of things. She'd accused me of murder. She'd accused me of human trafficking. She'd accused other people of a lot of things. I'm not saying any of that to diminish my accuser's credibility. I'm just noting facts that other people have reported in the time since the allegations were brought forward. There have actually been almost half a dozen different claims brought forward by my former staff, people who I spent a lot of time creating opportunities for. In the time since I replaced those folks after I won the primary, they've brought to the public concerns that I have a pattern of inappropriate behavior with my volunteers, which I don't. That got debunked. Then there was this claim by Liz. That's been debunked. My former staff have also accused me of not working hard, being paid too much. And one of the only set of claims that really have survived all of these different accusations is their claim that there was gender treatment in the workplace. And I've acknowledged that I have had tension with those folks in my mind, and to all the volunteers who worked with me and the people who were with me then who are still with me. That was always around campaign strategy and tension between the campaign direction that as the candidate I was directing and my paid staff who had other priorities and frankly didn't want to work on that campaign. They had their own campaign they wanted to run. And as I cycled those people off the campaign, we accelerated. The campaign grew dramatically. And then just after I saw you was the second of, again, about half a dozen different sets of accusations that those former staff had coordinated to bring to the press. And all I can say about this is that as a person of color, falsely accused of a sexual impropriety by a white woman, it was very disappointing to see press outlets presume the legitimacy of the accusations in spite of the evidence and in spite of the witnesses. It's been particularly disappointing to me to witness the self-described progressive and even socialist organizations here in San Francisco, unfortunately, embody any number of problems that we've seen well established in our society. To presume the guilt of people of color when we are accused has a long history. It's not one that anybody in San Francisco should be proud of. To ignore evidence and witnesses, DSA in particular affirmatively excluded witnesses and evidence, choosing affirmatively to rely only on the allegations and the accusations and do no due diligence or process at all. And, all I can do is run the race to represent my city on the basis of our shared values. And if institutional dynamics emerge in groups that, maybe struggle to embody their own principles, there's really not a lot I can do about that.
I just want to say for the record, too, as I kept my mouth shut, and I'm not going to name any names, too, as well, but it was about 9-10 months ago, I was on a Zoom or a Slack chat with some of the campaign that was going over there, and I had very serious concerns about this particular strategy the campaign was using, and I saw little flaws within that campaign. I didn't want to point them out or say anything because I wanted to stay, biased, not, I wanted to remain neutral on it and stuff like that. But I just want to put on for the record that I was really upset with some of the directions the campaign was going, and I think you needed to make a pivot and a serious change politically, strategically, and I don't think that anybody should hold that against you for doing so. And I was for making some of those changes because it was evident to me that this wasn't the way to move forward to try and take on the speaker. So I just want to point that out. I was silent about it, but fam remembers me getting off one of these phone calls, and I'm like, he's got to make a change. He's got to do something what's going to be best suited for him. So
I appreciate that. There's one voice in particular who's had similar reflections, been largely silenced, and in fact, entirely silenced by the local media. Media outside San Francisco have finally at least interviewed, but not yet published, the voice of Gloria Berry. And she's an Afro-Latina organizer, community activist. She's an elected member of the Democratic Party County Central Committee. And we actually met about a year and a half ago when we were both shoulder to shoulder on our feet in a DCCC meeting, because one of the DCCC members had used the N-word half a dozen times within 30 seconds. And Gloria has had some very choice words to say about the processes to which I've been subjected. After one of the DSA meetings, she publicly posted a reflection saying that she felt like she just left a KKK rally. And that's not something that anybody in that organization should be proud of. And it's not something that gives me any pleasure to reflect upon, frankly. And as much as I was the target of these accusations, ultimately, I recognize that the people harmed, it's the movement that bears the cost. And that's a regrettable thing. I do hope to see organizations embody their own principles, at least enough to guard against the emergence of white supremacy by ensuring due process when people are accused of things. That's fairly basic, and it shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't take throwing an immigrant candidate down a well to figure that out. I'm very grateful that in spite of what I was subjected to, that I'm still literally on my feet. You know, like a lot of people who were subjected to what I went through didn't survive to see the light of the next day. And I'm glad that I'm in a more privileged position than that. And I'm looking forward to representing my city, despite its challenges, in the next session of Congress.
So just shifting a little bit, news just came out that Trump wanted to assassinate Bashar Assad in a very mafioso-like way. He already took care of Soleimani, and despite talking a very big game about ending wars and running a non-interventionist campaign as a populist in 2016, Trump still feeds the military-industrial complex at an enormous rate, clearly. The Democrats, including some members of the squad, are also not informed on foreign policy. Only a few members of the Republican and perhaps the Libertarian Party bring up an end to the Afghan war. How can, if you beat Nancy Pelosi, how do you plan to actually work with, do you plan to work with any member of Congress, even across the partisan lines? Instead of, just working within the Democratic Party, because it seems to me like we need to cross the aisle in order to achieve an end to, or at least curtail our need for regime change and perhaps a new Cold War.
So let me first just deal with the foreign policy substantive question, then I'll get into the sort of legislative tactics. You're absolutely right that our foreign policy is ham-fisted, it's belligerent, it's inhumane, and it undermines U.S. national security. This is actually not new. It's interesting that you raised the war in Afghanistan. People forget, just to locate two moments in history, for the last 20 years, the longest running sustained conflict in our nation's history has been in Afghanistan. The Washington Post in 2019 reported that every progress report we've heard from Afghanistan in 20 years was based on lies. Which is to say, for 20 years, we've been treading water in a place that three other empires have invaded also. Well, two other empires before us, the British and the Russian empires, both of which crumbled on the anvil of Afghanistan. And I wonder whether that might be happening to the United States today. Rewind the tape 20 years before that, there's a great dramatization of this era, Charlie Wilson's War. And this was when the CIA was training Al-Qaeda. At the time, they were known as the Mujahideen, and they weren't fighting us, they were fighting the Russians. But the CIA and the military-industrial complex has long practiced a habit of contriving our future threats. Think about the particular moment here that rings out most clearly to me is the coup in Iran in 1953 that removed a democratically elected, accountable leader, installed an autocratic despot accountable to the U.S., and it was a revolution against that person in 1979 that created the theocracy that has been, basically like one of our, mortal enemies in the years since. And this pattern of contriving our own future threats, climate change comes to mind. What is the thing that we invade so many countries for? At least in the case of Iraq, it was oil. What happens to those fossil fuels? They end up in the atmosphere. To connect our wars for plunder with the mounting, accelerating global climate crisis is a point, frankly, that eludes a lot of people. The Green New Deal is a critical piece of climate justice. It's not the only piece. And to your question, dealing with our foreign policy and restraining our militarism is a critical component of establishing climate justice. To the second part of your question about how I aim to push that forward in Congress, there's lots of different angles here. One of them relates to human rights and promoting peace and justice as an alternative to militarism. That's well established and unfortunately not nearly influential enough. There are other opportunities. The big one here is essentially fiscal conservatism. There are any number of Republicans, to your point, who describe themselves as anti-war because they recognize that the amount of money we hurl at the military is simply unsustainable. Democrats, corporate Democrats, joined with Republicans this year to give our criminal president $750 billion for the Department of so-called Defense. There's never been a sum of that amount appropriated for a military expenditure in a year in the history of our species. And it's this criminal president who corporate Democrats showed up for in that way. And that's absolutely absurd, especially when we don't have PPE for frontline medical workers, and there are hungry people in the United States, and there's a mounting wave of evictions. There are real needs that we need these resources to address, and we are wasting them on measures and tools that can't respond to our actual threats. Just to make this poignant, and I think this is a pitch that many people on and beyond the Hill will resonate with, we do have legitimate, real national security threats. They include climate change. It's very poignant here in California because the entire state's on fire and we're all breathing it. And other of our national security threats includes a global pandemic. And there's a third in the form of a criminal president trying to avoid an election and basically suspend constitutional order. Every one of those three very real, pressing national security threats is entirely unrelatable to the Department of so-called Defense. We're spending $750 million to address a set of threats, none of which are anywhere near the top of the actual threats we confront. And if we're serious about dealing with national security, we have to recognize what it means. And it doesn't mean weapons, and it doesn't mean the job security of Defense Department officials or weapons contractors. It means looking at the actual threats addressing our country and responding to them. The eviction crisis, in my mind, is one of them. The climate crisis is another, and the pandemic is a third. Those are some real national security threats that I look forward to better addressing when I have a chance to represent San Francisco and Washington.
Julian Assange is on trial for serving time for exposing governmental lies. Mainstream media organizations like New York Times, Washington Post, they publish WikiLeaks, but they're not serving any time. And now they're not even covering the trial whatsoever. In fact, most of the progressive Democratic wing that we talk about has been eerily silent as journalism is under attack on every single level, it seems. Why is the Julian Assange case the most important civil case on the rule of law? And what does it mean for journalists if the United States extradites him here?
So Assange is the first publisher being subjected to these kinds of espionage charges based on what is effectively quintessential First Amendment protected journalism. And any number of voices, Daniel Ellsberg, to me, has been one of the most poignant in his reflections in Julian Assange's trial. Daniel Ellsberg was the military whistleblower who revealed to the American public, at great risk to himself, the then secret history of the Vietnam War. It was Daniel Ellsberg who let the American public know that we were lied our way into that war. And he, many years later, recognizes the threat, the profound threat to the public's right to know. When we talk about the rights of the press, or we talk about First Amendment rights, people forget that what we're basically talking about is the opportunity for people to be informed, to know what's going on, to not be lied to. And ultimately, that's why it's so important that we protect whistleblowers and that we protect publishers. Now, one of the reasons that I think people have taken their eye off the ball in the Assange case is precisely that, like any good journalist, he has offended lots of different people. It was when one phase in his career that he revealed and let the public see the footage demonstrating that the US military was committing war crimes and atrocities in Iraq and then covering it up, namely in the form of assassinating journalists. And there's the video, the collateral murder video that now millions of people have seen, not because the Defense Department owned up to its crimes, but because whistleblowers and this particular publisher brought those crimes to light. It was at another era that very same outlet published some of Clinton's emails. And so that offended very different people. And at the end of the day, we can't base our defense of the press or the public's right to know based on how we feel about the agents bringing those facts forward. It's not about, do we support Julian Assange politically or not? That's not relevant. The question is, do we support publishers and whistleblowers? The question is, do we support the public or do we support secrecy? Nancy Pelosi, my general election opponent, is very much all in for secrecy across contexts. I could make that case a dozen different ways. I am very committed to transparency. And I think that transparency as a value is precisely why we need to rigorously defend the rights of whistleblowers and publishers, including Julian Assange. I'd like to further, frankly, see a pardon for Edward Snowden and allow that whistleblower to finally come home. He's been effectively resigned into international exile because he can't get a fair trial within the United States. This is someone who the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals recently recognized performed an incredible act of public service in, again, informing the public, letting the public know, in spite of lies by executive officials, how our public agencies were using our resources. And this value of transparency is very much under threat, from the Assange case to Snowden to any number of others. And I'm eager to invite people to reconsider our commitments here and recommit to First Amendment principles and the public's right to know.
So a lot of the counterpoints to non-censorship is always security. You're a civil rights activist and lawyer. The Democrats appear sometimes worse than Republicans on protecting civil liberties, or simply relegate that to only being a right-wing narrative. They also push for an increasing amount of censorship, whether it's taking down YouTube channels for hate speech. Is there room to censor free speech for security and veracity in the truth? Because, I mean, a lot of people would argue that people like Alex Jones, etc., have a platform where they're spewing lies, so they want to protect people from those lies. But who has the right to decide what is true or not? Private entities, the government, or should the people decide what is factual and what isn't? Where do we draw the line here?
Our constitutional tradition suggests that the recipe for bad speech or false speech is more speech, that rather than anybody trying to shut anybody up, that the answer to these kinds of questions are just to make sure that the truth is among the voices being spoken and to have some faith and confidence that people will find their way to it. Now, of course, one of the problems today is that whatever basis we might have for that faith and confidence that people will find their way to the truth has been very profoundly shaken. It's not just people passively sharing their ideas. There are active engines of misinformation that are promoting that misinformation and weaponizing it. And that's unfortunate. I do think that the danger of censorship is bigger than the danger of misinformation, precisely because if you look historically, the voices that have always been most censored have frankly been the voices that have been defending communities. And however we might allow those principles to reassert themselves, they will never stay confined to the original context. I want to particularly remind people here of the COINTELPRO era. It's one reason I care so much about civil liberties. For me, civil liberties matter, but it's not just an object of like, you know, a sacred belief in the constitutional principles. I recognize that our country, for the better part of half a century, vilified civil rights activists, Puerto Rican independence activists, people seeking peace in the war in Vietnam. We talked about Daniel Ellsberg earlier. He was described by Nixon as the most dangerous man in America, and all he did was let the public know some secrets. This idea of making sure that we are standing on principles that we can be proud of going forward is a through thread for me. And when I look at this sordid saga of the 50 years during the COINTELPRO era, all of these different social movements, from this peace in Vietnam, civil liberties, civil rights, Black Power, equal rights for women, all of these movements were infiltrated by government agents seeking to neutralize them. That's despite the First Amendment principles that we've long been proud of. In fact, they unfortunately don't constrain the government from having done some very vicious things, not just to those communities, but ultimately to our democracy.
Well, I mean, you've been arrested for, standing up for our civil liberties, for attacking the security state. But Democrats and progressives, even alike, are so awful when it comes to this subject. And a lot of your hardened critics say that the thing that bothers me about Shahid Buttar is that he'll say corporate Democrats versus criminal president. In other words, they feel that you're a little bit too friendly with the Democratic Party and stuff. Well, I would argue that those corporate Democrats are criminal Democrats too as well. And all you have to do is look at Nancy Pelosi's finances to see that she's worth $120 million You know what I'm saying? You just take her salary, add it up, and it doesn't equate. But all the little deals and everything they did in the Ukraine was nothing less than criminals, especially when it comes to the emoluments, when you've been very, critical of Donald Trump too as well. So how do we know that if you get in, you will avoid playing partisan politics and go completely full out, even if it's unpopular, that a lot of the Democrats in the squad don't stand where you stand on these issues of civil liberties?
I would just say, look at my record. None of these positions that I'm taking are new for me. And frankly, the political spectrum was pretty far further to the right at different points in the past. So under the Bush administration, I was calling then for an end to militarism. And I frankly, those were my first political arrests. You can see in that history of activism, organizing, and litigation, pretty consistent principles. I've been quite willing to take unpopular positions at every point in my history. I'll give you two examples here just to demonstrate the point. Maybe the highlight of my litigation career was representing the second mayor in the country, Jason West from New Paltz, New York, who recognized and supported the right of gay people to form their own families and get married. And in supporting the marriage equality movement, this was 2004, we were fighting in the courts for gay rights 10 years before, at least in the case of my general election opponent, Nancy Pelosi, that she even acknowledged the federal right to marry. And that was not a popular position at the time. It was a popular position in San Francisco, but I was in Washington, D.C., working for a San Francisco law firm, litigating a case based in New York State. And this was not, even most Democrats did not support us at the time. I've been very willing to cross the Democratic establishment. I did it again, and this would have been 2011, maybe 2010. I have to set this up. So for 3 years, I worked at the American Constitution Society. It was founded in the wake of the Bush versus Gore decision to try to restore order and balance to the federal judiciary. And one of the particular figures who in the ACS network, we had, there were a number of figures from the Clinton White House and the Obama White House and the Justice Department in particular, who we had recommended for potential judicial appointments. One of those people was eventually nominated to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, where he now sits. His name is David Barron. And I pissed off a lot of people I'd worked with by circulating a petition on Credo. We got tens of thousands of signatures trying to keep this man off the bench, despite being a liberal champion favored by Democrats. And the reason I opposed him is because he wrote the memo saying it was okay for the Obama administration to assassinate U.S. citizens based on their speech using robotic drones. And the idea that drone strikes targeting Americans without charge or trial was in any way legal or constitutional is frankly preposterous. It's very offensive to me and the Constitution and to dissidents and democracy. And there too, I was willing to challenge my own team to do the right thing. And even now, think about who I'm challenging. I'm running against the head of the Democratic Party, and I'm doing it because the Democratic Party is institutionally complicit in the worst crimes of this administration. I'm particularly thinking at the moment about forced sterilization and ICE custody in private prisons. A lot of people, Nancy Pelosi herself this morning said that she wants to see an inspection and an investigation by the Inspector General and the Department of Homeland Security. That is really, unfortunately, insufficient, and it's long after the fact and overdue. Nancy Pelosi's been funding every DHS agency for the last 20 years. And whether you see that in the DHS goon squads in Portland and Kenosha that are cracking people's heads for daring to raise their voices, or whether you see that in forced sterilization and eugenics straight out of the Nazi playbook being used by DHS agencies at our border concentration camps, which she funded, I see corporate Democrats and the Democratic Party absolutely as part of the problem. And it's precisely why I'm running to replace them. As to this other cadre of Democrats, in my mind, there are basically corporate Democrats, there are a bunch of progressives, and there's a handful of people in the squad. I'm going there to be supportive of the principles that unite the country, like universal health care, climate justice, basic due process, keeping people alive in the face of relentless arbitrary state violence. These are principles that transcend party, frankly, and I'm going to be eager to work with anybody else who shares those principles. And if somebody doesn't share those principles, whether they share the party affiliation with me or not, I frankly couldn't care less. I'm not there to advance a party. I'm there to advance principles and can protect my constituents.
Nancy's fiasco with the hair salon or salon gate, then there's Newsom going to the gym when gyms are closed with the gym gate, paycheck gate. There are just so many examples of how Nancy Pelosi and Democrats have acted foolishly during this pandemic, have acted like the rules don't apply to them. Can you speak on the lack of her leadership that she has displayed during this crisis and what you would be doing instead?
One thing that this crisis with the pandemic particularly imposes is the need for people to be thoughtful about how we show up in public. So our campaign, for instance, we suspended door knocking because it places people at risk. We suspended indoor events. We were hosting almost weekly events before the pandemic emerged, and we suspended that. So our voter outreach activities at the moment are really predicated on outdoor socially distanced actions, and that's a way for us to meet the moment in a way that is responsible. Unfortunately, many of the incumbents feel any number of entitlements. In my mind, while I look at Nancy Pelosi's entitlement, certainly demonstrated in the instant you were describing, I see her entitlement demonstrated in more vivid terms by her refusal to debate an opponent. I'm the first Democrat in over 30 years that Nancy Pelosi has faced in a general election. She has never in 30 years debated an opponent. And how a powerful incumbent can claim to be a public servant when they can't even be bothered for a generation to defend their ideas in public, for me, gets really hard to square and sustain and even understand. And I do ultimately think that it's up to the voters of San Francisco whether we are okay with that. I certainly hope that my neighbors, if they aren't alarmed enough by corporate Democrats burying their heads in the sand as fascism rises, or funding these abusive agencies violating human rights, or ducking into the punch of a climate catastrophe without embracing the New Deal as I would, or for that matter, allowing costs to remain a barrier to care and remaining committed to predatory for-profit healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. If people aren't concerned about any of those issues, I do hope that San Franciscans recognize the reflection of entitlement in an incumbent who refuses to defend her ideas in public.
Well, Nancy Pelosi, she also stood up faster than Mike Pence to give Juan Guaido a standing ovation at one time. And she's shown numerous examples of how awful she is on foreign policy. We've been talking about it. But if you can pick one, Shah, just pick one that tell us that really highlights Nancy Pelosi's awful foreign policy in a nutshell, what would it be?
It's her imposition in the House rules of the rule that denies every member of Congress a staff member with security clearance. This cuts across every theater. It means that everywhere the CIA is active, no member of Congress outside her leadership cabal can access the facts. It means that anywhere the NSA is doing something, they can basically lie to members of Congress and get away with it because those members don't have independent access to the documents. It would be, and it has been the case, entirely defensible for members of Congress to have staff with security clearance so they can do their jobs of checking and balancing the executive branch. Nancy Pelosi, as the House Speaker, has centralized the House and diminished the capacity of offices across Congress to independently conduct oversight. That, in my mind, not only fuels every foreign policy abuse that you could fathom, but it particularly has constitutional valence. She is the leader of one of the branches of Congress, and she is, in this case, serving and empowering the executive branch. The first job of Congress is to fight the executive branch, not empower it. And I see her role with executive secrecy reflecting the somewhat predictable pathway of a powerful person who is chosen for influence and power based on their fundraising prowess, and not her understanding of history, not her understanding of policy, not her understanding of principles. I don't want to make this point too sharply because it's fair to say I do wield vastly more policy depth and experience than Nancy Pelosi did when she entered Congress. And she's been in Congress for 30 years. And so I freely acknowledge that she has gained a great deal of expertise in that context. But you see in the way that she gets rolled by the right wing over and over again that the lessons she has learned from her time in Washington are much more about politics, electoral politics, not policy, not constitutional principles. And frankly, she's been part, unfortunately, of the process as the Democratic Party has been gamed by this criminal president and twisted into supporting everything from the concentration camps at the border that Nancy Pelosi chose to fund in July 2019 to the tune of $4.6 billion each, to every one of the foreign policy abuses. I think particularly about, you asked me to name one, I'm just going to name one agency, and that is the CIA. There have been 3 different coups in the last 2 years, Venezuela twice, Bolivia and Brazil. They all fit a long-standing pattern. Is it a pattern that recurs? There's circumstantial evidence indicating the CIA's involvement. One of the reasons we can't pin the tail on the agency is because Nancy Pelosi prevents members of Congress from conducting their own investigations. So that's among the things that I would like to do, is if only by knocking the gavel out of her hands, get someone else in place who can issue a different set of House rules that hopefully better respect the roles of members outside the leadership.
Yeah, it seems like what Nancy Pelosi is doing to me is criminal.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you name the CIA. I mean, I the CIA is behind pretty much the vast majority of the state corruption, but Medicare for all, Green New Deal, campaign finance reform, these are all issues that excite the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the progressives in general. But in Congress, there's been little to no movement of actually getting solid policy. Part of that is because Nancy Pelosi is a gatekeeper. The other part is because, I don't know, how do you realistically move this needle to making these issues become policy in the current political state we're in, and where we currently, as progressives, don't have very much power in the electorate?
I do think our race is a opportunity to basically shift from one scenario to another. In one scenario, we have a handful of votes, and many of the powerful members of Congress return to Congress, and we are locked in this sort of tactical defensive posture to try to, win a vote here and there, and it's going to be a long slog. If we win this election in November, it will send a signal louder across Washington than any that's been sent in a generation. When Ocasio-Cortez unseated Joe Crowley in 2018, that was an earthquake across Washington. That was Nancy Pelosi's deputy. When we remove the Queen herself, there is a signal that it will send the rest of the Democratic Party. And it's a pretty simple message. It goes like this: we just removed the most powerful corporate Democrat in your stronghold. If you can't defend her, the rest of you aren't safe either, and you're either going to show up for our communities or we're going to show you the door. It's that simple. And I think that the rest of Congress might grow much more solicitous of these policies favored by a majority of the American public if they feel heat, if they feel threatened. And nothing will make corporate Democrats feel more threatened than removing their leader.
Shahid, I just got a question real quick about this state of what's going on here in California, too, as well. Because I argue with my mom all the time. She's like, these democratically governor-controlled states are just awful. And the one thing I can't ignore is the homeless problem. We have it in Orange County, we have it in LA, and have it up there in your district over there. What are you going to do to really dig in and solve this problem? Because I know you see this every day when you open up your door and you walk out on those streets. The homeless problem is just so far out.
Well, now we have fires and COVID.
And all this stuff. I mean, what are you going to do to act, I don't want to say accordingly, but immediately to try to help, put a Band-Aid over this problem right now, then maybe attack the core issue?
Well, I was actually maybe it's two different answers. I can give you an answer for how I aim to address homelessness. It is not an immediate fix, however. So to pretend that an issue that deep is going to have an immediate fix, I can't meet you there.
We just need immediate action. I don't know, immediate fix. We need somebody to really look at this and start acting, because nobody's acting.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a story about action and unhoused people in San Francisco, and then I'll try to come back to your original question about what I aim to do about it. About 6 months ago, 200 feet from my front door, one of my unhoused neighbors was shot by an off-duty FBI agent. And he survived, thankfully. And there were 3 community meetings that happened in the next couple weeks. And I want to just tell you about each of them, and it will reveal sort of how I aim to be different here. The first meeting was convened by a local nonprofit, the Homeless Youth Alliance. And it gave folks in the neighborhood, particularly unhoused folks, a chance to explain how they felt and grieve a little bit just for their own feelings of insecurity. And it was alarming to me and illuminating to discover how at risk everyone felt. And it's one thing if you have a home to understand that you have a domicile and some degree of legal protection. But when you don't have walls, you're very much at risk. And I think the entire unhoused community felt so precarious and threatened in the wake of this young man's shooting. It was something I learned from. And I noticed that there were no other public officials or candidates for public office there. The second meeting was hosted by many local leaders, including members of our Board of Supervisors, representatives from the police department, the DA's office. Everyone agreed on the panel that what happened with this shooting was totally unacceptable, that what happened in this shooting was alarming, and that there was nothing that anybody in the city could do about it because this was an act committed by a federal official answerable only to federal officials, not local ones. We have a very powerful federal official here. Her name is Nancy Pelosi. To my knowledge, not once has she ever said anything about this incident or written any oversight letters or done any constituent services, anything. The third meeting, our campaign convened in partnership with a local cop watch group. At the time, I'd been endorsed by DSA. We pulled them in, DSASF, and we together hosted a forum. Our campaign catered it. We brought together folks from the neighborhood as well as the survivor's family. It was the first time they were invited to publicly speak. They FaceTimed in the survivor of the shooting from his hospital bed, and everybody left that meeting signed up for counter surveillance shifts with SF Cop Watch. That's how I aim to be different. That's the kind of action I offer. I'm an organizer, not a fundraiser. Nancy Pelosi is a fundraiser who went to Congress. I'm a direct action organizer and a policy advocate and an impact litigator. I've spent 20 years studying all of the different ways in which I, without a seat in Congress, could be helpful. And I've frankly done all those things. I've filed court cases. I've led national nonprofits. I've been arrested here in San Francisco in the halls of Congress. I've done all of those things. And I'm eager the next time I ask someone a question in Congress for them to answer it instead of dragging me out in handcuffs. That's the kind of difference that I offer. Maybe that's a point worth raising too. I was arrested in the Senate for an act of journalism in 2015, asking the kinds of questions, frankly, that nobody's asked since. And I know the answers to the questions, and I really hope that the American people have a chance to hear them at some point too.
I think that's why I initially supported you, because of that, when you got arrested and whatnot. And to be fair to Nancy Pelosi, I think out of that meeting she said Haagen-Dazs for the poor or something like that when they walked out of that meeting. So let's give some credit, Shahid. Thank you.
So, you speak of journalism. I mean, a couple of days ago, a reporter was brutalized by sheriffs here. We have seen journalists be arrested. We seem to be headed towards civil war with the heavily politicized issue of police brutality and racism. Democrats like Joe Biden, though, have vowed not to defund the police, using similar narratives from the right, like the violent looters narrative, to describe the protesters. Trump has outright said, we got to go after these thugs, etc., pretty much fomenting what these people are doing. Is there nuance to defunding the police? Is there nuance to the issue of systemic racism? Is this something that we can agree to disagree on, or is this going to come to a tipping point?
One of the reasons why I'm committed to fighting the next president, be it Donald Trump or Joe Biden, is precisely because there's frankly so little daylight between them on so many policy issues. Joe Biden, over the course of his career, has certainly been no friend to civil rights at any point. And most of his references to having been in any way supportive of civil rights have been proven in the past to be lies. And it brings me no pleasure to say that. I wish that the Democratic nominee could be somebody that I could proactively and enthusiastically support. I'm, again, though, more committed to principles than party, and so I'll be fighting for racial justice and due process and dismantling our racist criminal injustice system. Now, to your question as to whether there are nuances, I think maybe one nuance that gets missed by a lot of people who recognize that Black Lives Matter and that our criminal justice system is racist, many of them will agree with those principles but stop short of embracing our community's calls to defund police. And I want to speak to those folks. If you recognize that police are racist and you recognize policing as an institution, not just police individually, but the enterprise of policing is institutionally racist, if you recognize that much and you recognize that policing is violent, if policing is a locus of violent racism in our communities, then it would suggest that it is the threat against which our communities need to be kept safe. Many people look at policing based on basically the propaganda of, network television, and they've watched so many cop dramas that they think that cops keep them safe. In fact, that's not what police do. If your impression of policing is based on Hollywood, I would just invite you to shed it, because that's not in any way relevant to reality or our policy. When we call to defund police, the point is not to invite anarchy. The point is to invest in better alternatives that will actually keep our communities safe and secure. That includes programs like ones that will employ social workers, programs like after-school programs that meet our community's needs and provide opportunities and pathways. These are the kinds of programs that our communities have been clamoring for decades. And instead, corporate Democrats have been doubling down on the same paramilitary, predatory policing paradigm that has united the Republicans. And so if there's any nuance here, I would say it's the opportunity for people who recognize the corruption of our system to break through its confines and consider alternatives. That's what we are embracing. When we say to defund police, a lot of people focus on the defunding police part. The important part to focus on is the investing in our communities part. Because the reason we want to defund police is to enable smarter, more rational investments. And that's what I'm eager to do in Congress.
Don't you think, though, that sometimes that it's just more focused on how we treat each other culturally rather than the elites and the politicians to allow this racism, this systemic racism to happen, and we don't concentrate on going after them as much? In other words, a lot of times I think the movement, when you go out to some of these rallies, is like, we have to recognize that there is racism. Okay, if we recognize that there is racism, how do we actually fight it and get, really good change? Because some of the alternatives that I'm talking about, for number one, I always say is that a police department should never be able to investigate themselves. It should be an independent outside source right away. And I think that would fix so much of the racial problems. It won't fix it all, but it will be a good start right now if they'll be held accountable. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I think about the LA Sheriff's Department gang, the executioners that have been recently in the press, because there's a whistleblower within the department who's tried to come forward and expose this violent ring of police officers who seem to celebrate violence and commemorate it and egg each other on and reward it tacitly. And this is corruption of the worst conceivable kind. It's one thing when criminals are motivated by, whatever they might be motivated by, but when they are protected by badges, that is problematic. And we basically have in some police departments what seem to be organized cells of organized crime. And in some places, that organized crime seems to have white supremacist elements. That much has been, frankly, documented in the public record for well over a decade. Many people have buried their heads in the sand about it. It is hard to ignore those findings at a time like this, when we have an open fascist in the White House encouraging vigilante violence. The idea that white supremacists have already infiltrated our law enforcement institutions, frankly, should keep a lot of people up at night. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have to be very vigilant and willing to defend our democracy at any cost.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted on that note, we don't have that much power in the electorate. We just saw what happened in Wisconsin, where they pretty much got rid of the Green Party off the ballot, and they're framing it as, at least we're getting absentee ballots. We stopped the freeze on absentee ballots. You've been a Green before. But I just don't think, I'm all for third parties, but I also don't think we have an organized Green Party. We don't have an organized third party. Our elections are a mess. Ranked choice voting would give a fair shake for a competition. What do you think about third parties right now, and how could we work to strengthen those parties so they do have a fair opposition to run against the corporate Democratic and Republican parties?
Key in establishing any third party is to start local. There are many minor parties that have, frankly, a great deal of representation in the United States, not at the federal level,
right,
but at the local one. Greens, Libertarians, the Working Families Party. There are a lot of parties that escape most people's attention because we focus exclusively on federal politics. So I just want to note that point first off. Second, you mentioned ranked choice voting. Absolutely, huge opportunity there to better respect voter choice. And ranked choice voting, where you just rank your choices among the candidates, is very user-friendly for voters. It can be confusing for election administrators, but that's not a reason not to embrace it. I think liberating voter choice and addressing the spoiler effect, where people are afraid to vote their conscience because they don't want to inadvertently support the other side, that's an unfortunate dynamic that first past the post politics forces on us. I'd like to, frankly, expand the conversation beyond ranked choice voting into forms of proportional representation. A full PR system, proportional representation, might look like a very different way of constituting the House. And this would require some pretty substantial reforms, but at the end of the day, what this looks like in other countries is, let's say in a state, you have 20 seats in the national legislature. Instead of having 20 separate elections and taking the first place winner in each one, you'll have one statewide election, and the party that gets 30% of the vote gets 30% of the seats. And the party that gets 10% of the votes gets 10% of the seats. The critical importance there is that there's points for second place.
Right.
When there are points for second place, democracy flourishes. When there are not, it ends up getting gamed in the same way that like game theory would suggest processes getting skewed by the participants leveraging the rules. I'm a beneficiary of a similar system. In California, we have a jungle primary, a top 2 primary. That's a process that gives points for only first and second place. It forces all the parties to run against each other. And because I already beat the Republicans, it's just me against Pelosi in the November election. It's the first time she's ever in 30 years faced another Democrat. And the reason I'm in that position is because California better respects our voters and the electorate by allowing a process that gives points, again, for second place.
Yeah. You know, somebody just left a super chat contribution. Thank you so much, Kate. It says, I want to see the angry Shahid Buttar saying, vote for me, damn it. Shit's on fire here and Nancy's MIA.
Just real quick, the fires, how has that affected you? What do you think about that? And what do you think about Newsom's fracking permits and their inaction right now while our state is burning, to be frank? I mean, we have a Democratic supermajority in Washington, Oregon, California, and yet we are some of the people experiencing climate catastrophe firsthand. And everybody's like, well, what are these Democrats doing? You know, like, what's going on here?
I'll try to take that in reverse order, starting with Newsom. On the one hand, our governor acknowledges how dangerous climate change has already grown. It kills Californians every year. And in spite of that, not unlike his aunt, my general election opponent, Nancy Pelosi, who also acknowledges climate change, but refuses to do anything about it, in spite of acknowledging the problem, the governor has awarded dozens of new fracking permits. And that's simply nonsensical. It is internally inconsistent. It suggests that maybe he doesn't have as tight a grip on his administration as he'd like. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, period. Beyond that, I see in Nancy Pelosi a very similar reflection, not of climate denial, but of climate delay, which I think is worse. It's one thing if you think that climate change isn't real, however ignorant you'd have to be to think that. But to acknowledge that it's real, to acknowledge the science, and then do nothing about it, is frankly just the height of hypocrisy. And that characterizes the entire institutional wing of the Democratic Party. Now, in terms of how it's been for me here on the ground, I'll make a couple points. One, a week ago, the sky was red at high noon. And I thought of that, among other things, not only a symbol of dystopia, but also kind of like a billboard for our campaign written in the sky. There's literally could not be more visible. The failures of the establishment were written in the sky. And we've all been breathing it, viscerally tasting and breathing in the poisonous fruits of climate chaos. And we have to get on the other side of this. And the incumbent has derided the Green New Deal, the most visionary solution to this species confronting problem. She's derided it as the Green New Dream or whatever. You asked how it's impacted me. I'll make a point here. We have a mutual friend, in fact, who has a mobile soundstage, which during the pandemic, it's been really hard for us to connect. We talked about some of this a minute ago with voters in ways that are safe for them. And so outdoor, socially distanced outreach events have really been increasingly a part of our voter outreach strategy. I was criticized for one of these such actions. The Guardian published an article claiming that I was part of an event that I was not at. And many of my former staff who've been critical of me have been spreading this rumor that I was part of a party at the beach that I did not attend. I was at the beach the next day to connect with voters in an outdoor, socially distanced, responsible way. And, the smears about me have included the claim that I was DJing this party on the beach, that I was starting fires on the beach. None of those things happened. So I'm noting this in the context of connecting two parts of our conversation. The wildfires have certainly forced pivots in our voter outreach strategy. And, those pivots have been the object of these false claims by my critics. All I can say there is that we remain committed to connecting with voters. When the air quality has been really bad, we haven't been doing those actions, both because I don't want to put my volunteers at risk and frankly, because there's nobody on the street. But I'm very grateful that the AQI, the air quality index, has started to improve this week. I do hope that there will be some opportunities to encounter folks out and about to help spread the word about our campaign in the weeks leading up to ballots arriving in just a few weeks.
Well, I can contest to this that you are a good DJ. I know that, baby, and stuff like that. We love the old school music over here. So, John, you got a question for Shahid or anything? Anybody, anything else?
I think we're good.
Shahid, did you want to speak a little bit more about the ICE situation, and then maybe you can tell people where they can go to find you, give you a few bucks, help you out, do those sort of things?
Thank you, Pasta. I appreciate it. This report out of Georgia with the hysterectomies, a couple of points to raise here. Human experimentation, which is what this rises to the level of. These are medical procedures that don't have medical indications. It's not in response to diagnosis. In many cases, these are procedures being conducted without the patients being given notice. And you can't claim, that's just such a gross violation of medical ethics to conduct surgeries on people who don't know what's being done to them. And this is not just a crisis in medical ethics, this is a crisis in human rights. And we don't have a right to, frankly, detain people in mass in the first instance. We fought a world war over the opportunity, among other things, for asylees to migrate as a matter of right. Many of the people detained in our concentration camps along the southern border are climate refugees. These are people fleeing a drought across Central America, a drought driven by a climate catastrophe in which we have been demonstrably long complicit. And the idea that the externalities, the predictable consequences of our own rapacity in resource plunder would drive people to flee their homes, only to then find their way in concentration camps and then operated on and forcibly sterilized by US doctors, is horrifying to me. I'm an immigrant myself, and I take immigrant rights really seriously, not just because I'm an immigrant, but because I recognize that what our country and the law does to us, it does to everybody else next. Biometric data collection and surveillance didn't start with US citizens. It started with programs targeting us, but then it became expanded to US citizens more or less immediately, again, using the secrecy that figures including Nancy Pelosi have supported. I not only want to close the Trump-Pelosi concentration camps, but I want to dismantle DHS. ICE and CBP are rogue agencies. Their responsibilities have to be transferred to other departments and agencies if we have any hope of recovering human rights. I feel very strongly about that. It's one of the principal points of differentiation between me and the incumbent. And for anybody who wants to get involved in our campaign, I would certainly welcome anyone, anywhere, to pick up the phone and join us with phone banking or text banking in the weeks remaining. Our average campaign contribution is $21. We've raised $1.4 million in $20 chunks. And if anything I've said resonates with you, please visit us online at shahidforchange.us.
Awesome, Shahid. Thank you very much for
Thanks
taking
for
the
joining
time.
us. Thank you, Shahid. We'll see you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. That's Shahid Buttar. You can go to his website, find out more about him. The chat's been going crazy. For Pasta Jardula,
Fiorella.
Jonny Sue on the ones and twos with Shahid Buttar.
Convo out, guys. Peace.